April 1945, 50 miles from Prague. American tanks sat idling on a muddy Czech road, their crews restless, victory within arm's reach. General GeorgePatton had just done the unthinkable. He'd crossed into Czechoslovakia against direct orders from Supreme Command. Behind him, Czech resistance fighters prepared to rise, believing American liberation was hours away. Ahead of him, Soviet forces closed in, ready to claim the prize for themselves. At Supreme Headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, rise, Sunserer, Sumrodenhaum, faced an impossible choice. Let his most brilliant commander finish the job or halt the advance and honor the alliance with Stalin. What happened next would shape 50 years of Cold War. On a crackling telephone line between the front and headquarters, Eisenhower spoke words that would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. What he whispered would cost an entire nation its freedom, define the limits of American power, and prove that sometimes the hardest victories are the ones you choose not to win. This is the story of the liberation that stopped, the promise that was broken, and the conversation that changed the world. April 16, 1945. The forests of western Bavaria trembled beneath the weight of American armor. Dawn broke over the muddy roads near Nuremberg, where columns of the 3rd Army's 4th Armored Division churned eastward, their exhaust mixing with morning fog. The air smelled of pine resin, diesel fuel, and something ancient, the scent of empires collapsing. General George S. Patton, Jr. stood in the turret of his command half-track, ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips, his face wind-burned and triumphant. Before him stretched the Bavarian countryside, and beyond it, something forbidden, Czechoslovakia. Behind him, in Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force at Reims, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stared at a map with the weight of history pressing against his temples. Between these two men, one thunder, one calculation, lay a decision that would shape the next 50 years of European destiny. The Third Reich was dying. Everyone knew it. The Red Army had taken Berlin's outskirts. British forces pushed toward Hamburg. American divisions swept through southern Germany like a mechanized flood. But the war's final act was becoming a race not against German resistance, but against time itself, against the political geometry that would define the post-war world. The Yalta Conference had drawn provisional lines across Europe's corpse, zones of occupation, spheres of influence, the careful arithmetic of alliance. Czechoslovakia, that democratic island swallowed by Munich's betrayal in 1938, sat squarely in the agreed Soviet zone. And George Patton, who had driven farther and faster than any Allied commander, who had relieved Bastogne and crossed the Rhine with biblical fury, now stood at the threshold of a liberation he had promised himself he would deliver. Patton had always seen the war differently than other men. While Eisenhower orchestrated coalition politics, while Montgomery planned with meticulous caution, Patton understood war as movement and will. He had studied Hannibal and Napoleon, had absorbed their lessons about speed and audacity. His Third Army had covered more ground, liberated more territory, captured more enemy soldiers than any comparable force in military history. Between August 1944 and May 1945, his units advanced over 600 miles, from Normandy's hedgerows to Czechoslovakia's border. They had averaged 30 miles per day during some offensives, an impossible pace that shattered every doctrine of sustained, mechanized warfare. His soldiers worshipped him with the complicated devotion men reserve for commanders who win battles but spend lives doing it. And now, in April 1945, with victory so close he could taste it like copper on his tongue, political considerations were telling him to stop. The order had come from Schaff, Supreme Headquarters, with Eisenhower's authority behind it. Third Army would halt at the Czech border. Soviet forces would liberate Czechoslovakia from the east. This was not military necessity, but political courtesy, the delicate dance of alliance management. The Red Army had bled for this victory, had lost 20 million souls in the grinding apocalypse of the Eastern Front. Stalin deserved his sphere, his buffer, his cordon of liberated territories that would never threaten Moscow again. Eisenhower understood this. He had spent the war managing egos and alliances, balancing British caution against American aggression, keeping the coalition intact through 1,000 small crises. He was a political general in the best sense, a man who grasped that wars are won by armies, but peace is built by diplomacy. But Patton saw something else. He saw Czech resistance fighters who had waited 6 years for liberation, who had endured Nazi occupation with the promise of American deliverance burning in their hearts. He He saw strategic positions that would matter in the next war. And Patton was certain there would be a next war, certain that the Soviet Union was not an ally but a temporarily convergent enemy. He had said as much, repeatedly, to anyone who would listen. We should go to the Oder line, he had argued. We should push to Berlin. We should finish what we started. His political instincts were clumsy, his statements inflammatory, but his strategic vision had a terrible clarity. He understood that the map they drew in April 1945 would become the cage of the Cold War. On April 18th, elements of Patton's Third Army crossed into Czechoslovakia. Not in force, not as a full invasion, but as a probe, a reconnaissance in strength. The 4th Armored Division pushed toward Pilsen, liberating villages, accepting flowers from weeping civilians, racing eastward with the momentum of 4 years of war behind them. Czech resistance fighters emerged from forests and cellars, seizing Nazi officials, marking collaborators, preparing for the freedom they had imagined in whispered conversations. And in those villages, American soldiers became something more than liberators. They became symbols of a choice, representatives of a world where democracy might survive totalitarianism's hunger. The soldiers of the Third Army had expected victory, but they had not expected this. They had fought through France's bocage, where every hedgerow hid a German machine gun nest. They had endured the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge, where frostbite claimed as many casualties as bullets. They had crossed the Rhine under fire, had seen cities reduced to rubble, had walked through concentration camps where the smell of death hung so thick it seemed to have weight. They had become hard men, capable of extraordinary violence, intimate with mortality. But in Czechoslovakia, they encountered something different, gratitude that transcended language, a liberation that felt complete, whole, as if the war's moral purpose had finally crystallized into something pure. Czech civilians lined the roads, waving American flags they had hidden since 1938. They brought out casks of Pilsner beer, loaves of bread baked in celebration, bottles of Slivovitz plum brandy that burned like liquid memory. Young women kissed GIs with a desperation that spoke of years without hope. Old men wept openly, pressing the hands of American tankers, stammering words in broken English. Thank you, thank you. We never stopped believing. And the American soldiers, these farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, these men who had joined the war to avenge Pearl Harbor or escape the Depression, found themselves weeping, too. Found that the exhaustion and trauma of 2 years of combat suddenly meant something, carried a weight beyond mere survival. But behind this liberation moved the machinery of alliance politics. At SHAEF headquarters, Eisenhower received reports of Third Army's advance with mounting alarm. He had given a clear order. He had negotiated with Soviet commanders, had coordinated boundaries, had promised, verbally, through diplomatic channels, that American forces would respect the agreed zones. And now Patton, brilliant and insubordinate, was threatening to unravel everything. Eisenhower faced a choice that transcended military tactics. Would he enforce discipline and retreat from Czechoslovakia, honoring alliances at the cost of liberation? Or would he allow Patton's advance to continue, risking the coalition that had defeated Hitler? The telephone conversations between Eisenhower and Patton during those days in April have become the subject of historical myth and careful scholarship. There are no complete transcripts, no recordings, only fragments reported in memoirs and official records. But the essence is documented. Eisenhower ordered Patton to halt. Patton argued, equivocated, asked for clarification. Eisenhower insisted. Patton advanced anyway, framing it as operational necessity, as tactical flexibility, as the fog of war. And Eisenhower, who had commanded the largest amphibious invasion in human history, who had held together a fractious alliance through 3 years of continental warfare, found himself confronting a subordinate who believed his own strategic vision superseded political reality. What did Eisenhower say? The historical record preserves pieces, fragments encoded in military language. George, you must halt at Pilsen. George, I need your word. George, I am ordering you to stop. But between these official communications, in the unrecorded moments when 2 old friends and fellow warriors spoke across the distance, what truths were exchanged? Eisenhower knew Patton's genius, had protected him after the slapping incidents in Sicily, had restored him to command when others wanted him court-martialed. He knew that Patton was right about Soviet intentions, knew that the map they were drawing would haunt them. But he also knew that winning the peace required sacrifices as painful as winning the war. The symbolic object that recurs through this moment in history is not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but a map. Not the grand strategic maps that hung in headquarters, marked with colored pins and grease pencils, but the personal maps that commanders carried, folded and refolded until the creases became fault line. Patton carried such a map, marked with his own hand, arrows showing intended advances, circles around Prague, notes about terrain and bridge capacities. He studied it constantly, this paper representation of possibility, this document that showed what could be rather than what politics allowed. And Eisenhower carried maps, too, but his were marked differently, with boundary lines, occupation zones, the careful demarcations of alliance. These two maps, overlaid, told the story of two visions for victory, one that prioritized military completion, one that prioritized political sustainability. By April 25th, Third Army units had penetrated deep into Czechoslovakia, liberating Pilsen, pushing toward Prague. Czech resistance fighters in the capital, hearing of American advances, prepared to rise against the remaining German garrison. They believed liberation was hours away, believed that the democratic West would not abandon them to Soviet occupation. Radio broadcasts called for American help. Resistance leaders sent desperate messages through underground channels, and in those messages lived a terrible innocence, a faith that because America had liberated France and Belgium, because American soldiers represented a different vision of power, they would not stop short of complete liberation. But on April 26th, Eisenhower issued an unequivocal order. Third Army would advance no farther than Pilsen. Prague would be left to Soviet liberation. The order came with all the force of Supreme Command, with explicit warnings about career consequences for disobedience. And Patton, who had never met an order he couldn't creatively reinterpret, finally understood that this line was absolute. He halted his advance. American tanks sat 50 miles from Prague, engines idling, crews restless, while Czech fighters died in the streets of their capital and Soviet forces maneuvered into position. What Eisenhower whispered in the end was not recorded in official histories or military cables, but we can reconstruct it from the aftermath, from the choices made and the consequences endured. He whispered, "I know you're right about tomorrow, but I have to win today." He whispered, "I know what we're surrendering, but we cannot win the peace alone." He whispered, "History will judge us for stopping, but it will judge us more harshly for breaking faith with our allies." These were not the words of cowardice or betrayal, but of a different kind of courage, the courage to accept imperfect victory, to understand that liberation has many meanings, and that the world they were building required compromises that burned the soul. For Patton, the halt order was a wound that never fully healed. He had promised Czech leaders he would reach Prague. He had promised his soldiers their advance meant something beyond maps and borders. In his diary, in letters, in angry conversations with staff officers, he expressed a bitterness that transcended military disappointment. "We should have gone to Prague," he wrote. "We should have made them retreat." The them in that sentence was revealing. Not the Germans, already defeated, but the Soviets, already recognized as the next enemy. Patton saw the post-war world with prophetic clarity, saw the Iron Curtain before Churchill named it, understood that American restraint would be interpreted as weakness. But Eisenhower's decision reflected a different wisdom, harder to see in the moment, but validated by history's long arc. The alliance with the Soviet Union had been necessary to defeat Nazi Germany, breaking that alliance in April 1945, before Hitler's suicide, before Germany's formal surrender, risked catastrophic consequences. A race to Prague might have triggered armed confrontation between American and Soviet forces. It might have given Stalin justification for extending the war, for refusing to honor agreements about occupied territories, for creating an even more hostile post-war environment. Eisenhower gambled that maintaining alliance discipline, however painful, would preserve the framework for eventual peace. It was a bet against his own instincts, a choice that prioritized process over immediate outcomes. The Czech people paid the price for this decision. Prague rose in revolt on May 5th, believing liberation was imminent. Czech fighters, armed with weapons hidden since 1938, seized key buildings, attacked German positions, declared their freedom. For 4 days, they battled the Wehrmacht garrison while waiting for American tanks that never came. Soviet forces arrived on May 9th, after the uprising had already secured most of the city. The Red Army claimed credit for Prague's liberation, and within 3 years, Czechoslovakia had fallen completely into the Soviet sphere. Democracy extinguished by communist coup. The Americans who had stopped at Pilsen, who had obeyed orders and respected boundaries, became a bitter memory, a promise withdrawn, a liberation incomplete. Yet the soldiers of Third Army carried their own memories. They remembered Czech villagers in Pilsen, free because American armor had come. They remembered children who learned to say thank you in English, who received chocolate bars and chewing gum with the solemnity of religious offering. They remembered old men who had fought in the First World War, who understood that liberation is always partial, always compromised, always purchased with blood and measured against political necessity. And they remembered the strange paradox of that moment, that they had won completely while feeling that they had lost something essential, that victory carried within it the seeds of the next conflict. The recurring symbol of American presence in liberated Czechoslovakia was not a weapon of war, but a product of peace, food. The American soldiers who entered Pilsen brought with them the logistical miracle of American abundance. Each day, Third Army consumed thousands of tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food in quantities that seemed magical to Europeans who had endured 6 years of rationing and hunger. GIs distributed K-rations to Czech civilians, shared their coffee and cigarettes, explained the incomprehensible fact that American soldiers could afford to waste food because so much more was coming. Czech citizens who had lived on bread and thin soup, who had not seen coffee or chocolate in years, encountered a form of power more persuasive than military force. The power of surplus, of casual abundance, of a system that could feed its soldiers like kings while fighting a global war. This food became more than sustenance. It became proof of concept, evidence that democracy and capitalism could deliver material prosperity beyond anything totalitarianism could match. The Soviet soldiers who liberated Prague days later came with different gifts: discipline, sacrifice, the terrible strength of an army that had marched from Stalingrad to Berlin. They were victors who had suffered unimaginable losses, who had endured sieges that killed millions, who had beaten Hitler by matching his brutality and exceeding his endurance. But they did not have chocolate bars to give children. They did not have cigarettes to share casually. They came as liberators who expected gratitude, but offered only the grim solidarity of shared suffering. And in that contrast, Czech citizens glimpsed the swipe of their future, a liberation that felt more like occupation, a freedom defined by new borders and old suspicions, now against his own instincts, a choice that prioritized process over immediate outcomes. Eisenhower's whispered words to Patton, whatever their exact form, carried the weight of this understanding. He knew that American power rested not only on military force, but on the soft power of prosperity, on the image of democracy as a system that delivered abundance. He knew that the long competition with the Soviet Union would be won not on the battlefield, but in the minds of people who had to choose between systems. And he knew that maintaining the alliance, honoring agreements, even when they felt unjust, was essential to establishing America as a reliable partner, a nation whose word could be trusted even when circumstances made betrayal tempting. The transformation that occurred in those days along the Czech border was not primarily in the German enemy, already defeated, already dissolving into captivity and chaos, but in the American understanding of their own power. Soldiers who halted at Pilsen learned a hard lesson, that military victory does not automatically translate to political victory, that winning battles is easier than winning peace, that alliances constrain even the strongest partner. Many of them were bitter about the halt order, felt they had betrayed the Czech people they had promised to liberate. But others, particularly the officers who understood strategic context, recognized that Eisenhower's decision represented a different kind of strength, the strength to accept partial victory for the sake of sustainable peace. Patton never forgave the decision. In the months after Germany's surrender, as he commanded occupation forces in Bavaria, his public statements about the Soviet Union became increasingly inflammatory. He advocated for rearming German units to fight the Soviets. He questioned the morality of denazification while tolerating communist expansion. He pushed against every constraint, every political consideration, every diplomatic nicety. And in December 1945, in a suspicious car accident near Mannheim, he suffered the injuries that would kill him. Conspiracy theories have circulated ever since. Was it really an accident, or was Patton's vision of renewed conflict too dangerous to allow him to live? The truth is probably simpler and sadder. He was a warrior made obsolete by peace, a man whose genius was tactical but whose judgment was catastrophically political. Eisenhower carried the weight of the Czech decision for the rest of his life. As Army Chief of Staff, as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, as President of the United States, he faced repeated accusations that he had lost Czechoslovakia, that his restraint at the war's end had enabled Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. His defenders argued that the alternative was worse, that racing the Soviets to Prague might have started the Third World War before the atomic age had fully dawned, that maintaining alliance discipline in 1945 made NATO possible in 1949. Both perspectives hold truth. History offers no clean counterfactuals, no way to know what would have happened if Patton had disobeyed and American tanks had entered Prague first. But we can trace the consequences of what did happen. The Czech people lived under communist dictatorship for 43 years until the Velvet Revolution of 1989 finally restored their democracy. The Iron Curtain that Churchill described in 1946 ran through Central Europe for nearly half a century, dividing families, imprisoning nations, creating the geopolitical tension that defined the Cold War. And the American soldiers who had stopped at Pilsen, who had obeyed orders and respected boundaries, carried a complicated legacy. They had won the greatest military victory in human history, but they had also learned the victories. So victory is always incomplete, always subject to political calculation, always purchased at a price that cannot be measured until decades later. The epilogue of this story is written not in military history, but in the long arc of ideological competition. The whispered conversation between Eisenhower and Patton, order and defiance, restraint and audacity, political wisdom and strategic vision, represented two responses to the same recognition: that World War II's end was World War III, beginning, that the alliance against Hitler was already fracturing into the confrontation between capitalism and communism. Patton wanted to fight that war immediately, with the momentum of victory behind him, with German territory occupied and Soviet positions vulnerable. Eisenhower understood that such a war could not be won militarily, that the competition would be won through persistence, through alliance building, through demonstrating that democratic systems could deliver prosperity and freedom more reliably than totalitarian ones. In the end, Eisenhower was right in the way that matters most. The West won the Cold War. Not because American tanks reached Prague in 1945, but because American values, flawed, complicated, often betrayed in practice, but powerful in principle, proved more attractive than Soviet authoritarianism. The Czech people who welcomed American soldiers in Pilsen in April 1945 had to wait 44 years for complete liberation, but they never stopped believing in the possibility of freedom. They preserved democratic memory through decades of oppression. They raised children who understood that the world contained alternatives to totalitarian control. And when the moment came in 1989, they seized their freedom with the same courage they had shown in 1945, proving that liberation delayed is not liberation denied, that the arc of history is long, but bends toward justice. What Eisenhower whispered to Patton was a truth about power that transcends military force, that the strongest nations are those that can restrain themselves, that honor commitments even when breaking them would be easier, that build alliances on trust rather than fear. It was a whisper about the burden of American power, the burden of leading a coalition, of managing complexity, of accepting that perfect victory is impossible and that compromise is not betrayal. And it was a whisper about the future, about a long twilight struggle where the weapons would be economic competition and ideological appeal rather than tanks and artillery. The soldiers who halted at Pilsen did not fail. They won. But they won a harder victory than the one Patton imagined. A victory that took decades to complete and required patience and endurance rather than audacity and speed. They won by demonstrating that American power could be restrained by principle, that alliances mattered more than glory, that the long game was worth playing even when the immediate costs seemed unbearable. And in that restraint, in that agonizing decision to stop, when momentum said go, they planted the seeds of a victory far greater than Prague's liberation. They planted the seeds of an alliance that would contain Soviet expansion, that would rebuild Europe, that would eventually win the Cold War without firing the shots that would have started World War III. The forests of western Czechoslovakia are quiet now. The roads where Third Army columns halted in April 1945 carry civilian traffic, Czech families on vacation, German tourists exploring history, young people who know the Cold War only from textbooks. There are memorials in Pilsen to American liberation, maintained with care, visited with reverence. Old men and women who remember those days are nearly gone now, but their children and grandchildren preserve the memory that American soldiers came, that they brought freedom and chocolate and hope, that they stopped before the job was complete, but not before the promise was made. And in Prague, there are memorials to May 1945, to the uprising and the Soviet liberation, and the complicated truth of how freedom came and went and came again. History remembers Patton as the warrior who was too bold, too visionary, too impatient with political constraint. It remembers Eisenhower as the statesman who understood that war is politics by other means, that victory is measured in generations rather than battles, that the hardest decisions are those that surrender immediate glory for long-term stability. Both men were right, both men were necessary, and the conversation between them, whispered across telephone lines, encoded in orders and arguments, and the silences of disappointed obedience, represents the eternal tension in American power, between force and restraint, between moral imperative and political reality, between the war that is and the peace that must be built. What Eisenhower whispered was this: I know what we're losing. I know what this costs. I know that we will be judged for this, that history will wonder why we stopped, that the Czech people will remember our promise and our retreat. But I also know that we cannot build the peace we need by breaking faith with our allies, by starting a war we are not prepared to fight, by choosing pride over prudence. So we stop. We stop because alliance matters more than territory, because trust is a strategic resource, because the world we are building requires us to be more than conquerors. It requires us to be partners, to be steady, to be worthy of the burden we are about to carry for 50 years. And Patton, brilliant and tragic, whispered back, "Then we have won the war but lost the peace. We have defeated Hitler only to surrender half of Europe to Stalin. We have liberated France, but abandoned Czechoslovakia. And when the reckoning comes, when Soviet tanks face American positions across a divided continent, we will wish we had finished what we started when we had the chance." Both whispers were true. Both futures were real. And the tension between them, between audacity and restraint, between moral clarity and political complexity, between the soldier's creed of complete victory and the statesman's burden of sustainable peace, defined not just that moment in April 1945, but the entire American experience of the 20th century and beyond. The war ended, the peace began, and in the forests of western Czechoslovakia, where American tanks halted and Soviet influence began, the long struggle for freedom paused but never stopped, waited but never surrendered, endured because the promise of liberation, once made, can never be completely withdrawn. That is what Eisenhower whispered. That is what Patton heard. That is what history remembers. That victory is never perfect, that freedom is never simple, and that the hardest choices are those where every option carries a cost too heavy to bear, but too necessary to refuse.